Historical mysteries are some of the most intriguing and sometimes creepy mysteries out there. Time and a lack of evidence always make it less and less likely that these mysteries will ever be solved, but many have a variety of unusual suggested explanations. Number 5. The Zagreb Mummy is one of the most unusual and strangest artifacts to come out of classical-era Egypt, wrapped in a mystery that is still unsolved today. It may seem absurd today, but even as late as the 1840s, European tourists could visit Egypt and purchase mummies and sarcophagi that were being sold in street markets in cities like Alexandria. Most of these were obviously fake, but some were genuine articles that had been taken from ancient grave sites. A Croatian official was lucky enough to purchase a genuine mummy when he traveled to Alexandria in 1848. He took it back to his home in Vienna, where he unwound the linen bandages from around the mummy and displayed the body in his office. After the man passed away many years later, his brother donated the mummy and her wrappings to a museum in Zagreb, where a strange discovery was made. The wrappings were covered in writings that could not be understood. At first, it was thought to be ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. When that was ruled out, it was thought to be an Arabic translation of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. It wasn't until 1891 that the language was correctly identified as Etruscan. The Etruscans were an ancient group of people that lived in Italy before the Roman Republic took over the area. Very little of their writing remains. In fact, the linen wrapped around this Egyptian mummy, which would later be given the name Liber Lenteas, is the largest example of Etruscan text ever discovered. Because of this, translating what the text says has not yet been possible. Discovering the language of the text would only deepen the mystery of the Zagreb mummy. Given it was sold in Alexandria, it's fair to assume the mummy had been buried in Egypt, but locating her original grave and what kind of grave goods she may have been buried with is now impossible. It's not unimaginable that a wealthy Etruscan family fled to Egypt and were later buried there. The linen has been dated back to about 250 BC and is believed to have been written in Tuscany. This was around the time when Rome began to conquer its neighbors, so it makes sense that a group of Etruscans found themselves as refugees in Egypt not long after the text was written. The only problem was a piece of papyrus was found in the sarcophagus. The note names the woman as an Egyptian woman named Nessie Hensu, the wife of a tailor from Thebes. This was not an Etruscan woman. Rather than the Liber Lenteas being so important to the woman that it was buried with her, the opposite now seems true. It was simply the only linen the embalmers had on hand when the woman passed away, or so it seems. But this doesn't line up with what little of the Etruscan text we understand. The Liber Lenteas seems to be a religious calendar. Seeing as it made its way from Italy to Egypt, it seems strange that it would be treated so poorly. For now, how Nessie Hensu became wrapped in a seemingly significant text from a culture that wasn't her own, or exactly what that text says, remains a mystery that may never be solved. Number 4. During the Second World War, a number of important historical and artistic artifacts were lost. One of the most famous was the Amber Room, which disappeared during the European campaign. But on the other side of Asia, an artifact much more important to scientists disappeared. Peking Man, referred to as a set of fossils belonging to an early human ancestor. They were found in caves that were given the nickname Dragon Bones Hill during the 1920s. The 20s were still an early time for paleoanthropology and were only just beginning to understand human evolution. The fact these bones belonged to ancient humans and not deformed apes was still being debated. Peking Man was still being studied when Japan attacked China during the Second World War. Because of their importance, the Chinese government tried to find a way to save the fossils. They were boxed up and sent to a US military base, where they would be flown back to the United States for safekeeping. However, what happened after they left the site in September of 1941 has never been determined. Decades later, the Chinese government and scientific organizations around the world are still trying to locate the bones. One possibility is that the train they were traveling on was attacked by Japanese soldiers. They were either discarded or worthless, or taken back to Japan. It's possible the bones are in Japan somewhere, either purposefully hidden, or the location and its importance long forgotten. It's also possible they were aboard a ship that sank. Another possibility is that the bones made it to the military base, but the soldiers decided to bury the bones rather than transport them to the United States. In 2010, the son of a former US Marine wrote to a South African university to tell them of a story his father told him. His father had been stationed in the port city during the Chinese Civil War. While digging foxholes one night, they came across a box of bones. Spooked by the discovery, they reburied the bones and dug their foxholes somewhere else. When investigators went to the site, they discovered it was now a parking lot, but the Cultural Heritage Office will monitor any developments at the site. If the bones still exist, they could provide important information about how human language developed, as well as other important insights. But for now, their location and even their survival remains a mystery. Number 3. Beneath countless rural areas across Europe are strange, unexplained tunnels that remain a mystery. Earthstall tunnels are mostly found in southern Germany and Austria, but have been found as far away as France and even Great Britain and Ireland. The strange tunnels are thought to date back to the medieval period, but no record of their building was ever found. Earthstall tunnels are not like the grand secret tunnels of the ancient world. They range from between 20 to 50 meters, have one entrance and exit, and are extremely narrow. An adult would have to crouch to walk through them, and in some places might even need to get on their hands and knees. In some places where tunnels at different depths connect, there are narrow slip points that require anyone passing through to squeeze and contort their bodies. Entrances to the tunnels have been found in old farmhouse kitchens, hidden in old settlements, or even in the wilderness. They're obviously human-made, and many look swept clean. But why they were created and what they were used for remains a mystery. The fact that they only have one entrance makes it unlikely that they were built by bandits to hide, given that it would be easy to block airflow and make it really easy to surround the target. Given how narrow the tunnels are, it's also impractical for them to have been used on a regular basis. Many of the tunnels are below the waterline and often flood in the winter, making storage also an unlikely option. Given the lack of inscriptions on the walls and no record of them ever being built, it doesn't seem like we'll ever have answers to these mysterious historical locations and why they were created. Number 2. In 1876, a German archaeologist obsessed with the legend of Troy proclaimed that he had found the gravesite of the ancient Mycenaean king, Agamemnon. What he had actually found, while not quite the stuff of legends, was even more mysterious and fascinating. Agamemnon was one of the many Greek kings that featured in Homer's Iliad as taking part in the Trojan War. According to the classical Greek legends, he sacrificed his own daughter in order for the winds to be good enough to sail to Troy, gaining the wrath of his wife. He survived the war, only for his wife and her lover to take his life once he returned home. While most historians agree, much of the story of the Trojan War was just a legend, it's possible many of the characters were based upon real kings and heroes, and that an actual war did take place just before the Bronze Age collapse. Amateur archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann definitely believed the basis of the story to be true and spent decades of his life searching for what he called the treasures of Priam. In doing so, he caused a huge amount of damage to archaeological sites, but did find some impressive artifacts which he then smuggled out of the area. In the 1870s, he turned his attention to the other side of the conflict and began looking for the tombs of the Greek kings. He believed Agamemnon was buried within the walls of the city of Mycenae, and he began excavation on what would later be called Grave Circle A. and found more than anyone could have expected. Grave Circle A consisted of 6 grave shafts, which contained the remains of 19 people. A huge amount of treasure was also found buried with them, which included gold, amber, and ivory. None of these things were local to the area. Gold would have come from northern Greece, amber from northern Europe, and ivory from Africa. Some of the bodies were completely covered in gold, and in one shaft, an intricately created grave mask was found. Schliemann proclaimed that these were the graves of Agamemnon and his family, and the mask was to be the Mask of Agamemnon. There were plenty of doubts, given Schliemann's controversial history, but nobody could find anything wrong with the mask to indicate that it was a fake. Later tests would prove the mask was ancient, in fact, more ancient than Schliemann claimed. The whole site dated back to the 1600s BC, hundreds of years before the Trojan War is thought to have taken place, if it ever did at all. At this time, the people living in the area weren't known to be particularly wealthy or trade much with outside cultures. Places like Minoan Crete and Egypt were the major powers, but there was no record of them having much to do with this area. This wasn't the start of a new tradition of burying important people with luxuries either. The grave circles at Mycenae appeared to be a one-off. Archaeologists are puzzled by the mystery of how such impressive goods could have made their way to Mycenae at a time before the city was even built. There were no inscriptions indicating who the people were that were buried there. The area was used as a religious site years later, with no record indicating who this grave was built for. Who owned the supposed Mask of Agamemnon remains a mystery, and one that, when solved, could lead to a whole new understanding of Mycenaean Greece. Number 1. Mystery Bay in New South Wales, Australia, earned its name due to the mysterious disappearances of 5 women in 1880 that remains unresolved to this day. Lamont Young and 4 other men were last seen aboard a boat heading north from Bermagee. Lamont was a geologist working for the mines department. Gold had been found in New South Wales decades earlier, and the mines department had taken over organization of the digs. Lamont had been sent to survey Bermagee and had decided to go further north afterwards to survey some of the other potential gold fields. He and his assistant hired Thomas Towers, who owned a boat, to take them to the northern site. The 3 men were accompanied by 2 other fishermen, leaving Bermagee on the evening of October 9th, or the morning of October 10th, a Sunday. The boat was seen a few times as she sailed north. According to an article published 7 years after the disappearance, witnesses sunbathing on the beach saw 3 or 4 men aboard the ship as she sailed, while the other men possibly were hidden by the sail. However, all modern versions of the story say that a witness saw just a single man aboard the ship that morning. That evening, a farmhand named Johnson was riding along the beach at what is today Mystery Bay. He spotted the ship against the rocks, its sails either down or missing. A search of the ship found 5 bags of clothes and Lamont's spectacles, and notes laid out neatly. Despite the things not being out of place, there were definitely signs that something strange had happened. First, there was evidence someone had been extremely ill, though the weather conditions on that day of the disappearance hadn't been enough to induce seasickness in any of the men. Then there were rocks found in the hull of the boat, apparently taken from the beach where the boat had been found. A bullet was found embedded in the starboard side of the ship, while the matching casing was found on the beach. Strangest of all, there was a hole in the front of the ship where it had crashed into the rocks, but it was found that it had been made from the inside of the ship. It was also impossible for it to have simply drifted where it was found. There was evidence someone came ashore and made a small meal on the beach before vanishing. Whether this was Lamont and his companions or someone else has never been determined. The early police investigation into the disappearance was lackluster, with the reward for information about the missing men being comparable to that for information on a hay bale that was found being burned. Possible tracks were not investigated, and it was assumed the 5 men were lost at sea, There were a number of sightings of people that did not fit the typical miners from the area heading towards Sydney, and it was suggested that these were the people responsible for the Bermagee 5 disappearance. But it's likely the truth will only ever be discovered if the remains of the missing men are ever found. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knots, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.